Well, good evening, everyone. I think everyone can hear me. I believe the mic is on. My name is Mark Gottlieb. I am the director of the Williams Graduate Program in the History of Art, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to the beginning of the symposium, Alternative Art Histories, Future Directions in U.S. Latinx Art. Before I make a very few opening remarks, I'd like to ask you to turn off your cell phones, silence your cell phones, that is. I'd like to remind you that if you are looking for washrooms, there are some just outside the exit on the right. And I hope I have this right. If the fire alarm goes off, then we should all congregate in the main lobby, even though the hors d'oeuvres will have been cleared away, and await further instructions. This symposium has been organized by two individuals who have, as it were, reached across the temporal and generational divides to collaborate on what I know promises to be an outstandingly interesting intellectual event. Ondine Chavoya, Professor of Art and Latino Studies here at Williams, and Marco Antonio Flores, a second-year MA student in the Williams MA program in the History of Art. The MA program, offered collaboratively with the Clark Art Institute, an independent museum and research institute that has hosted the program since its founding 50 years ago. The MA program, working with our colleagues at Williams, the Clark, Mass MoCA, and other partners, has always collaborated on, sponsored, or helped support a range of art historical programming, workshops, seminars, colloquia, conversations, and more, always with a view to supporting the work of our students and of bringing those students into contact with the shifting methodological and theoretical terrains of the history of art, past and present. That includes, for example, our own annual MA symposium here at the Clark, where Marco, in fact, along with his MA colleagues, will share with us the fruits of their intellectual labors over the last 2 years. That event is scheduled for Friday, the 31st of May, and I hope many of you in the audience will return to the rainy precincts of Williamstown on that occasion and get to hear what Marco and his colleagues have been working on. A public symposium of this kind, however, this evening and tomorrow, is a model of intellectual work that we in the MA program have only rarely taken on. But I think it's a very important expression, an important demonstration of the critical relevance of the Latinx field within the larger communities of art history that jostle for attention here in this small town where art history operates as a virtual 24/7 activity. And I have this information only anecdotally, but it seems quite possible that this may be the first public symposium within an art history institute devoted exclusively to Latinx art. And if it's not the first, it's among the very first, and we're very proud indeed to be part of that history. So it's very important to all of us that new work in this field take such a visible and public form. And I hope that all of you here in the audience, in your questions and interactions, formal and informal, with our speakers, can help make this event a true and represent this event and show all of us what the conventions of conventions of intellectual exchange as they should prevail here in Williamstown. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Marco to introduce this evening's keynote speaker.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? It got a little hot all of a sudden, so. Great. So, welcome, bienvenidos a todos, todas. So I'm going to read a little bit from my script, and then I'll also be introducing Laura Perez. In the canonical text, This Bridge Called My Back, Writings by Radical Women of Color, here we go, by Shirley, Moraga, and Gloria Saldúa, they propose a theory in the flesh, quote, one in where the physical realities of our lives, our skin color, the land and concrete we grow up on, and sexual longings, all fuse to create a politic born of necessity, end quote. Published in 1981, the collection of intimate letters, poems, and critical essays sought nothing short than a revolution in the hands of women. They were determined to create bridges, spirit connections, and most importantly, alliances in which those living at the margins all work together to realize an intersectional feminism. They were committed to practicing a fearless radicalism, all along knowing, as Audre Lorde writes, we were never meant to survive. But as their writings continue to resonate in us today, survive we must and survive we will, because our future depends on it. I share this vision by women of color because I want to propose that we think of the concept of aesthetics in all of its multiple creative forms as they call on us to do. Foremost, I encourage us to consider aesthetics as a revolutionary strategy that can offer sensitive practices to some of the most obdurate social injustices: the dehumanization of immigrants, the colonization of indigenous waters and lands, the racist prison industrial complex, ongoing exploitative capitalist systems, and the homophobic and transphobic violence happening daily. In imagining the possibilities of aesthetics, we may also consider what Laura Pérez tells us in her groundbreaking book, Chicana Art, The Politics of Spiritual and Aesthetic Alterities. Her insight is that the aesthetic, especially with regard to the arts, is not only a source of politic, but is also a mediator of soul-making. She writes that the arts embody and facilitate the critical, truth-seeking, and daring consciousness that is necessary for both social and spiritual well-being. If we are receptive, the arts allow us to undergo a transformative process of the mind, the eyes, the heart, and the spirit. For Perez, Chicana artists of the 60s to the present are a vital part of the creative legacy of counter-narrative, visionary thought, and social practice. Artists such as Celia Herrera Rodriguez, Laura Aguilar, and Patsy Valdez inspire greater balance and harmony. And while Perez asserts that the art of Chicanas is among the most vibrant today, it remains the most threatened by sparse institutional funding and limited exhibiting opportunities. Despite commercial uncertainty, their art continues to create a liberatory tactics that embodies theories of resistance and visionary ideals for social transformation. Therefore, we must conceive of art and aesthetics as a greater gesture of yearning and ofrenda toward greater personal integrity, empowerment, and social justice. Moreover, Chicanx and Latinx artists continue to be active agents in foregrounding ancient but relevant alternative knowledges that connect fragments of our lives and make visible the interconnectedness of all beings, both human and non-human. For many, art pays homage to the unseen but felt presences in our lives, whether these are deities, ancestors, or the memories and histories of our personal, familiar, and collective past. While some have drawn from pre-Columbian mythology, others have conceived of creative expression from local and cultural hybridities and family traditions. The aim, to create new meaning by yoking together different creative languages, whether high or low, high-tech or rascuache, tacky or DIY, the popular or the pre-Columbian, the spiritual or the profane, Chicanx and Latinx artists strategically employ a multiple conceptual and ideological frameworks, and thus allowing them to search for alternative models, and as we are doing here, making visible alternative art histories that challenge the cultural blind spots of mainstream values. And for some, alternative models that also help survive and heal from the Euro-American oppressive forces at work. In conceiving of alternative art histories, future directions of US Latinx art, I follow the feminist and queer philosophies that have inspired my understanding of art as politic, spirit-making, and creating consciousness. This vision further arises from conversations in and outside of the classroom, and especially from those moments of joy in graduate seminars with Professor Ondine Chaboya. It arises from the aha moments in the archive, moments fueled by a burning desire to make memory and create a future. The symposium arises from a question that has emerged within me very unexpectedly but urgently. How are we as art historians and art curators responsible for making room for art histories that have been conveniently left out of the canon? For me, the focus on the aesthetic legacies and contributions by Latinx artists and Latinx art also comes from the recent exhibitions such as Access Mundo, Queer Networks in Chicano LA, curated by Ondine Chaboya and David France, and Radical Women Latin American Art, 1960 to 1985, curated by Andrea Junta and Cecilia Fajardo Gil, that have become inspiring curatorial models for queer and feminist brown futures. Exhibitions that propel us to envision something more. As queer theorist José Esteban Muñoz so beautifully writes, queerness is something not yet here. And thus we must actively map alternative futures in which we may dream and enact new and better pleasures, other ways of being in the world, and ultimately new worlds. Thus today and tomorrow are a collective effort to create more expansive, capacious art histories, para hacer campito for those art histories that continue to unfold, to grow, and allow us to reimagine the field. I am grateful to the Williams Graduate Program in History of Art for their generous support. Mark Gottlieb, thank you for being so gracious and kind throughout this entire process. Karen Kowitz and George Ferger, without your programming expertise, this event would not be possible. To Olivia Mele, thank you for your sincere encouragement. And I am also very grateful to the Clark Art Institute for graciously hosting us. Professors Julie Bryan Wilson and Marie Rodriguez Bini, your presence on this campus has been a gift to many of us. Thank you for being part of this collective esfuerzo. To my art colegas, Esicaso, William Hernandez, Elman Alejandro Sosa, thank you for indulging me with your presence. Your conversations have been nourishing and have helped me understand the groundwork we are doing here, and also to understand the work that is ahead of us. Professor Ondine Chaboya, you have been such a vital force. I am grateful for your patience and guidance in this momentous collaboration. Thank you for teaching me to have the courage to call myself an art historian, along with understanding the playful pleasures of the archive. Your curatorial philosophies are inspiring. To our guests, thank you all for your light and for being here. We are delighted to have you. Finally, I want to conclude by sharing something Laura Perez once shared with me during a walk at Berkeley. Busca lo bueno y lo encontrarás. One must always look for the good in order to find it. And today, among our invited guests, in the presence of mentors and friends, colegas and visionaries in the field, I have found it. And now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our keynote, Laura Elisa Pérez, currently professor in the Department of Ethnic Studies and core faculty in Performance Studies. She teaches on U.S. Latinx literary, visual, and performance arts, U.S. women of color feminist and queer thought, and decolonial spiritualities and aesthetics. She is also the chair of the new Interdisciplinary and Trans-Americas Latinx Research Center at the University of California, Berkeley. Perez has curated UC Berkeley's first Latino performance art series, co-curated Chicana Bad Girls, Las Hociconas in 2009, and curated Laboratorio Bay Area Latino Arts in 2011. Perez is also author of Chicana Art, The Politics of the Spiritual and Alterities, where she theorized aesthetics and spiritualities of more than 40 Chicana artists from the early 1970s through the early 2000s. In her forthcoming book, Ero Ideologies, Writings on Art, Spirituality, and the Decolonial, Perez offers a plentiful garden of writings to point toward the power of creativity and eros to create a harmonious flowering of individual, collective, and planetary coexistence. She is currently co-editing with Anne-Marie Lamer an anthology on Chicana artist Consuelo Jimenez Underwood titled Consuelo Jimenez, Art, Weaving Visions. And finally, Perez is also co-curating a retrospective of Amalia Mesa Baynes at the Trident Museum in Santa Clara, California, with Esther Fernandez. Please join me in welcoming Laura Elisa Pérez.
I'm so happy to be here, and I'm so honored to be here and to be a part of what, as Professor Gottlieb said, is surely a historic event. We recently had in Houston another historic event, yet another Latino Art Now conference. I think it was the 5th one. And it's number 5, right? And so it's incredibly exciting because I think that something is really happening. They're getting larger, and we're seeing more and more. Now we're in a 3rd generation of people not only making art that they want to identify as in one way or the other, Latino, Latina, or Latinx, but also people who have been very deeply thinking, both how to make work and how to make intellectual work that is adequate to that. And so it is an exciting time, and I'm very grateful to this institution for supporting the work of scholars like Undine Chaboya and the Latino Studies Center, and welcoming Marco Flores, who I urged to come here to work with Undine and to fly the coop on comparative ethnic studies, because I could see that he was really loving visual art and he really needed to do a lot more of it. So I just also want to say that there's something, there's also something, I don't know how to put it really well into words, but Undine was also one of my first graduate students at University of Rochester when visual cultural studies was being hatched. And Marco, of course, was in our doctoral program or the master's program as well. And that too is also personally exciting, that the passage of time continues to weave people together in ways that are both personally warm, but also where you begin to see that networking is something that is very natural, and it's supposed to be the sharing of knowledges, right? The building together what we can't do by ourselves. What I'm presenting to you today, and Marco told me it made him giggle that I was not going to show any slides to a lot of art historians and visual cultural studies scholars, but there you go. Today I am not going to talk about particular artists, but I'm going to talk about larger issues, kind of metacritical things, and it's part of the forthcoming Eros ideologies, writings on art, politics, and the decolonial art, spirituality, and the decolonial. I just got my own title wrong. So this is called Undead Darwinism and the Faultlines of Neocolonialism in Latina/OX Art Worlds. Cultural Darwinism is the Eurocentric premise that the cultures of politically, economically, and socially dominant peoples are the result of nature's own law of survival of the fittest so-called races, as demonstrated by domination itself, and that all other cultures should and will, if properly exposed, progress or modernize in the footsteps of the presently dominant. The least desirable should be discouraged from populating in eugenics. Cultural and racial Darwinism, decisively elaborated by Charles Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, is about as intellectually and rationally unsound and self-servingly Eurocentric, that is ethnocentric, as racial phrenology and the theory of quote-unquote race have been. Cultural Darwinism is a master tool of post-Enlightenment thought, rationalizing geopolitical imperialism and the devaluation of the cultures that colonizing empire represses, marginalizes, or supplants. In dominant cultural art world discourses, as in other forms of dominant cultural humanities and social sciences thought, the burden of proof of relevance, adequacy, universality, impartiality, truth, and importance rests on the presumably inferior, backward, naive, parochial, non-European, or insufficiently Euro-Americanized. Other. Cultural Darwinism is like patriarchal sexism and heterosexism, where respect and accessibility and acceptability depend on definitions created by patriarchy and heteronormativity to legitimize themselves over women and the queer. It is a catch-22. Cultural Darwinism is tautological. What constitutes equal from its point of view is only what it validates to begin with. It cannot recognize difference with respect to itself as anything other than lagging, and to the degree it is able, it inculcates what it projects, the yearning, the anxiety of those it marginalizes to become like the dominant cultural. This is methodology of the neocolonial, as Chela Sandoval might put it, and precisely what her theory of the methodology of the oppressed brings into view and exposes as dominant historically and culturally specific ideology rather than the universally true cultural outcome of nature itself, as it would have us believe. It thus covers up its own ahistorical and false essentialisms. Two important anthologies published in 1996, Beyond the Fantastic and Santeria Aesthetics in Contemporary Latin American Art, laid out the quandary for both Latin American and US Latino artists with respect to the possibilities of inclusion in a global art world still dominated by Euro-American and European art. With few exceptions, even Latin Americans raised its dominant cultural in their own countries found that the global art world, like the global economy and intellectual production in general, was still dominated by the legacies of European imperial powers, even those in decline. How Latin American and US Latino arts, historical, aesthetic, and conceptual or thematic concerns are received, artists and critics in these collections pointed out, is embedded within the logic of imperialist binary logic, either orism. Latin American and US Latino art are only visible, legible, or intelligible as mimicry of the so-called first world, where quote-unquote first world is understood without need of explanation as superior, as most modern, let alone as postmodern. Such imitation is understood as stigma and second-rate. Or the concerns and methods of this art are to be read as quote-unquote authentic, if a naive performance of the folkloric, the non-European as a precondition. This either-or binary of inauthentic imitation of dominant art or so-called authenticity via nationalism and folklorism functions as a condition of legibility for dominant culture, but from which dominant cultural artists are somehow exempt. In essence, this is the reenactment, the repetitive performance that reproduces a colonial legacy of more than 500 years in ever-modernizing ways as the neocolonizing, the translation of the unfamiliar into the familiar, and thus its management, its disciplining, its repression, if not its erasure. With respect to the Americas, it is the willful or unconscious, but in all cases methodical recodification, scrambling, replacement of the worldviews of the indigenous and then the African diasporic and of other non-Europeans and mixed peoples. To share a historical anecdote from Serge Gruzinski's La Guerra de las Imágenes de Cristóbal Colón, a Blade Runner, regarding initial cultural struggles in what would become Mexico after independence, colonization exercises itself at the moment in which the culturally unfamiliar indigenous sacred bundle, named through an unfamiliar indigenous word, is translated by the colonizers from an admittedly culturally unknown quantity to the ostensibly knowable and familiar as a foolish, superstitious, naive fetish, the zemi. The unfamiliar is dismissed as unimportant through the performance or guise of universal knowing, through translation of the culturally different into the culturally same. In a similar manner, because overdetermined by the legacy of colonizing thought in so-called post-imperial, post-nationalist, post-racial US and European cultures, the Latin American and US Latino become legible, that is tolerable, through the either-or of translation into dominant cultural worldviews and power dynamics. Whether supposedly mimicking the dominant cultural worldview or performing what might actually be more authentic to it, reduction to binary, Orientalist-like ideological projections by the dominant culture of the subordinating culture perform and reinstall domination. To the degree that we, in all our varieties, buy into these cultural binary projections, they are disciplining versions of the Latin American and US Latino that reproduce the racially based inequity of the cultural, intellectual, and economic landscapes within which the art worlds function. Gatos por liebres, cats passing as hares. The prefix post continues to proliferate, as if the yearning it captures could perform the leap beyond the reality it wants to leave behind, but to which it is bound by the phenomena itself. Post-colonialism, post-structuralism, postmodernism, post-industrialism, post-feminism, post-race, and the very slippery post-identitarian. In 1977, Mexican novelist Maria Luisa Puga engaged Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o, later the author of Decolonizing the Mind, The Politics of Language in African Literature, in a conscious not choosing of Europe and Euro-America as intellectual and political interlocutors, in spite of their global hegemony, in an effort to undermine the colonizing bindery I've referred to above, emanating from global powers even in its liberatory forms. In her novel, Las Posibilidades del Odio, Hatred's Possibilities, Puga observed that independent, that is, politically post-colonial and multiracial Kenya, and by analogy, Mexico, were not necessarily decolonial or beyond the Eurocentric. Puga represented the complex multi-ethnic culture of post-colonial Kenya as a mirror of third worldism in order to illuminate the still unfinished work of decolonizing post-colonial cultural and social realities in Mexico. In the early 1990s, when post-colonial theory began to circulate widely in the US, scholar Francis Aparicio observed that Puerto Rico was a case in point as to why neither the United States nor Latin America were in fact post-colonial. And in a graduate seminar I taught on the history of US women of color thought of the late 60s through the 2000s, one student offered that the difference between US women of color feminism and that of post-colonial feminisms was precisely the post, the ostensible development, progress, in sophistication of analysis in advancing beyond earlier essentialisms with respect to the complexity of identity. Jasbir Puar's terrorist assemblages, Homo-Nationalism in Queer Times, concludes on such a note. What is becoming an all too familiar analysis posits that we need to move beyond the language of intersectionality to something more fluid, more mobile, savvy, such as the language of assemblage and disassemblage. In a campus presentation at UC Berkeley after the publication of her book, Puar exhorted US women of color thinkers to get with the program and read the same people she had been recently reading, more European male thinkers, whose thought, unlike women of colors, we were to assume, remained evergreen, never needing to be publicly upbraided for intellectual backwardness and datedness. Puar enters feminist thought at a time when white feminist historical accounts, as Sandoval has carefully shown, appropriate and re-narrate the little it knows of women of color thought in mainly self-serving ways, preserving hegemonic racial privilege, even if rendering it difficult to detect in homogenizing narratives of development. In accounts where feminism as a whole ostensibly progresses through stages of contradiction, such as essentialism, and from lesser ideological awareness into newer resolutions of greater democratic and inclusive thought, the complexity of Chicana, other Latina, African American, and other 60s and 70s women of color thought is ahistorically redated to the 80s, well after second wave white feminism's own reemergence in the 60s, and in a derivative way with respect to the latter, and finally, insufficiently examining the game-changing theoretical and analytical contribution of women of color thought, the project Sandoval maps in her masterful Methodology of the Oppressed. But at least from 1969, Black, Chicana, and Native American feminists point to the histories of female resistance to racialized slavery, colonialism, and occupation in individual publications and anthologies. Frances Beale, 1969, Moraga and Saltua, 1981, Gloria Hull et al., 1982, Beth Brandt, 1983, Smith, 1983, Alma Garcia, 1997. Even today, postmodern or post-structuralist white feminism's indebtedness to the Black civil rights movement of the 50s and to US women of color thought of the 60s and 70s remains insufficiently acknowledged as intellectually powerful analyses of social reality in the United States and other multicultural countries that were created through the tensions and inequities of imperial histories between quote-unquote first and quote-unquote third worlds. Women of color's hard-won concepts, as they themselves elucidate, emerge from their unsanctioned analyses of their and their community's own existence. But these concepts are appropriated and misrepresented in the 90s and thereafter, turning women of color critique of the essentialist gender and sexual identity politics of white feminist essentialisms against them, in a wholesale judgment and dismissal of the theoretical naivete of pre-European post-structuralist thought in the United States. Women of color's complex analyses of dehumanizing identity formations created by racializing patriarchal and heteronormative colonial and neocolonial cultures captured in Combahee River Collective's Simultaneity of Oppressions, 1977, is unread, erased, absorbed, or rendered so self-evident that these analyses and concepts may be absorbed, unattributed, and shallowly engaged, if at all. Instead, U.S. women of color's complex concepts of social identity and its construction are attributed solely to European and derivative Euro-American post-structuralist thought. The much later concept of intersectionality, developed from more complex earlier formations of identity and social reality to pragmatically serve in courts of law, is both taken as a belated origin of important women of color thought proper, and it is literalized spatially as a descriptive of less fluid movements, as coarse, angular, and two-dimensional graph plottings. But this misunderstanding of Kimberly Crenshaw's formulation is only possible in the absence of knowledge of women of color thought before her apt critical legal studies formulation, which was necessary to real-life transformation of the legal system. The allure of the posts is embedded to some degree within Darwinian gendered and racialized timescapes of progress and backwardness, in binary oppositions between postmodern versus the modern, where the modern or the liberal now stand in for the intellectually and culturally primitive, whose origin in faux theories of racial primitivity is minimized, if even referenced. One of the reasons I wrote Chicana Art, The Politics of Spiritual and Aesthetic Alterities was because of an anecdote related by a 1960s generation female artist in which a Chicano male artist 10 years her junior had publicly disparaged references to indigeneity in Chicano work in general as passé, as a sure sign of backwardness, nostalgia, nationalist romanticism, and idealism. He and another male Chicano member of the art panel they were all sitting on presented themselves as new, hip to post-structuralist theory, new in their disavowal of stereotypes of what Chicano art might be. Given that her work is well known for engaging the indigenous, she was without question being thrown under the bus in public as Exhibit A dinosaur. Not only was the male artist rude and self-serving, he was wrong, unable to understand the decolonial character of her choices. His assumption, derived from unexamined neocolonial logic, though parroted increasingly by people of color, anxious to appear non-essentializing, was that by virtue of passage of time, first-generation 60s and 70s thought and art must be less sophisticated, unwittingly primitive in its naivete, no longer relevant to current postmodern sensibilities, if not realities. There is much that can be analyzed here around racialized gender and economic differences between the pair in question, and thereby of the greater ease of passing into dominant cultural art worlds of the one over the other. But suffice it to focus on the inability of the post-Chicano self-styled anti-hero to allow the possibility of decolonial aesthetic politics at work in the referencing of the indigenous, and to see that such citations are not necessarily folkloric, but in her case, philosophical, that is, about culturally different notions of being, of existence, and ideologically critical of false, yet imposed, universal aesthetics and social values. Such observations, however, cannot be made from Eurocentric, art historical, and philosophical registers. It requires knowledge of what are, in fact, historical, but also living indigenous worldviews about art, artist, perspective, knowledge, truth, and being that are about the present and the future, and not simply artifacts of a lost past. When engaged seriously, strategies of indigenous and the African diasporic art historical hybridity create what some have called third spaces that refuse either or binary thought and oppositions, such as the unexamined assumption that the past is dead and reference to it by necessity, romantic, ahistorical, and useless for the complexity of our moment. Focusing on the Chicana Chicano for the moment, reading certain more recent curatorial essays, I have also been struck by the anxiety that renders these writings on some levels apologias for Chicana Chicano art. Utopian assertions about mutual assimilation that ignore the widespread racialized inequity that is obvious walking throughout major cities and their major museums, or that emphasize that artists do not identify as Chicanos first, when many have only been able to advance their careers through that still politically significant self-denomination, is at best naive. The point that as artists, they do not identify as Chicana Chicano first does not constitute an innovation. To assume that it does is Eurocentric and condescending. For some art writers, there is an uneasy tension rooted in the assumption that more recent work is important because it is so different from earlier Chicano movement art, based on the caricaturizing assumption that the Chicana Chicano cultural politics and notions of identity of the previous era were simplistic, one-dimensional, and now surpassed by more universal or at least local concerns, as if these were no longer about racialized inequities as well. The ostensible contrast between past essentializing identity and a post-identitarian now is at times resolved by identifying two lineages, one represented by artists characterized as conceptual and the other characterized as naive or essentialist or nationalist. Discussion of pre-Columbian symbols and earlier Chicana Chicano art in particular strips these citations of decolonial aesthetic politics. Ongoing concerns within the larger Mexican-American community and immigrants and their plight are in fact the abiding backbone of Chicana Chicano or Mexican US, as well as other US Latinx cultural and aesthetic politics of various ideological hues. It is an unsubstantiated premise that Chicana Chicano artists born in the mid-50s, 60s, and 70s, rather than the late 30s through the early 50s, are more at ease with the idea and practice of identity as non-essential, fluid, changeable, ambiguous. Noting that Chicana Gloria Anzaldúa, a foremost theorist of the hybridity and queerness of identity as constantly changing, was born in 1942, should perhaps suggest the naivete of such a view. Key French post-structuralist philosophers were born much earlier. Gilles Deleuze, theorist of rhizomal politics and assemblage theory, in 1925. Félix Guattari, psychoanalyst and co-author with Deleuze of foundational works, in 1930. Michel Foucault, theorist of epistemes, genealogical alternative historicizing, the panopticon, disciplinarity, biopolitics, in 1926. Jacques Derrida, theorist of difference and discourse through ideologically significant slippage and the undecidability of meaning, in 1930. Giorgio Agamben, theorist of the bare naked life of domination versus the disruptive life of the living, and thereby also of assemblage theory, in 1942, like Anzaldúa. Bruno Latour, another theorist of assemblage beyond binaries, in 1947. Most of these European men were older than those who came of age in the late 60s. Chronology is hardly a reliable indicator of progress, particularly if the seeming newness is due only to the lag in translation from the original French publications. Nor is the intellectual capital in dominant cultural academia of assimilating French philosophical discourses a guarantor that this thought is of necessity superior or appropriate, that it is more complex, subtle, deep, or refined than US women of color's thought, which emanates organically from the significantly different locations of still oppressed populations, still oppressed bodies. As if infectious, we are careful to now avoid cultural celebration or affirmation of Mexican-American cultural difference, unlike the historic Cara exhibition, Resistance and Affirmation, its subtitle, which surveyed work from the mid-60s through the mid-80s. What we are ostensibly to celebrate, strangely enough, is the absence of aesthetic antidotes to the internalized racism and essentializing myths regarding Mexican cultural and biological inferiority and the supposed superiority of the European and thereby the Euro-American. We are to translate as legible to Euro-American dominant cultural art the work of Chicano artists now, as if the latter had advanced with an undisputed notion of progress and backwardness around identity, as if a new generation of artists finally got what European post-structuralists, a generation older than the first generation of Chicano movement intellectuals, understood. These Chicano cutting-edge, post-identitarian, post-modern, post-Chicano, post-algo, post-something, in effect means finally all caught up, almost, with the tired contradictions of imperialist, neo-colonizing modernisms. But here's the thing. The unread, not dead, insufficiently read, widely misread archives from the 60s, 70s, and early 80s of intellectual and artistic work of US women of color have not been surpassed in the complexity of notions of identity as changing, fluid, compromised, negotiating, problematically imposed, continually transformed, that is, in current terminology, identity as performative, as both essential and non-essential, as constantly shifting, transforming, yes, assemblages of being as a becoming, and in terms of the effect of different locations on being and action. U.S. women of color feminist thought from Frances Beale, Audre Lorde, Ana Nieto Gomez, Elizabeth Petita Martinez, Marta Cotera, the Combahee River Collective, and Carol Lee Sanchez, just to name some of the most theoretically astute, articulated double, triple, multiple, and simultaneous oppressions as the intellectual, decolonizing, analytic tools for deconstructing dominant cultural ideologies masquerading as universal truths, and they analyzed their racialized and gendered conditions within the politics and economics of colonial, patriarchal, heteronormative, ethnocentric, i.e. Eurocentric, racializing imperialism. Puar sketches what I find a straw man caricature of women of color thought through one of its later articulations, intersectionality, a concept she neglects to contextualize in its development, as I've said, in critical legal studies as a tool in courtroom practice. Puar appears unaware of the complex notions of being and existence that women of color in the US articulated nearly 2 decades before this term, which in 2016 electoral politics, even Hillary Clinton finally caught word of and appropriated. I mean, she was their generation. She should have been using these concepts way back in the 70s. But better late than never. In Puar's erroneous renditions, intersectionality is the product of unsophisticated, unwittingly obedient notions of identity, being and existence, and is based on some rigid geometric model of discrete, quote-unquote, coordinates that work synthetically and bind dominant cultural identity politics, end of quote. This misrepresentation of intersectionality and of the more complex notion of simultaneity of oppressions and multiple identities from which the former is derived serves as a foil against which to contrast the European assemblage theory that she now adopts for thinking various kinds of queer and terrorist bodies as instead being, quote, in concert, as interfacing matrices, end of quote, as fluid, changeable processes rather than static, locationally fixed identities. The critique of falsely essentializing, falsely discrete identities that reproduce the master's tool, as Audre Lorde might have put it, by reproducing the logic of divide and conquer as truth-based, is by necessity first made in US feminism of white middle-class feminism by African-American, Chicana, and other women of color feminists, and not the other way around. Even Giorgio Agamben points to the necessity of differently located, differently produced voices around being and existence as crucial to what he calls a coming politics, one that from a person of color perspective must operate in a decolonizing way, more fully outside the colonizing and the neocolonizing. We are post something, but post what? We are understandably having a very difficult time analyzing the economic and political realities of the last 40 years and connecting them to our theorizations, curation, and scholarship. We are challenged to see how the last 20 years of dominant culture have reckoned with the 60s and 70s powerful destabilizing critiques and the shifts in social reality that accompanied these. With respect to Latinx culture, nowhere more powerfully is the problem of difference under prevailing power relations that create subjected individuals and communities illuminated and analyzed than in U.S. Latina feminist and Latinx queer thought, and in serious engagements with non-Western, indigenous, African diasporic, and other notions of being and their explorations of thought beyond binaries and categories within the logic of Eurocentric thought. This thought is in dialogue with and nurtured in coalition among U.S. women of color thinkers, including artists, quite often outside the gatekeeping strictures of academia. U.S. women of color thought does not arise from armchair theorizing, but rather surreptitiously feeds it. Borrowing language from European philosophers as old or older than U.S. women of color of the 60s and 70s, developed by the former to describe their social and political relations in their spheres of experience and knowledge is useful to all of us. But it is not automatically a better way to describe the social reality, being, and experience that arise from careful reflection on the locations, histories, and strategies for survival that U.S. women of color experience as well as study and theorize. Quite the contrary, I think anyone would argue. For myself, how to survive on this continent and planet promises to be more clearly illuminated by the indigenous elders who carry knowledge that has survived and helped them to survive more than 500 years of genocidal cultural repression and other forms of violence, and who transmit millennia of specific environmental knowledge about life in this part of the planet, alongside the scientific and philosophical knowledge, alongside other scientific and philosophical knowledge about humanity in general. European leftist or progressive thought regarding the possibilities of knowledge and social justice is a welcome voice in what should be a global body of knowledge, and one that preserves the ancient wisdom of all peoples alongside that of the ancient Greeks. I am eager to also read the women of color of France and the rest of Europe, but I am at pains to understand the logic of how a nation, the United States, which has been characterized since its inception by the struggle for survival against colonization, colonial settlerism, anti-indigenous physical and cultural genocide, African slavery, anti-Mexicanism, anti-Puerto Ricanism due to imperialist wars and appropriations, and anti-Asian discrimination, I'm at pains to understand how we are to be lectured on multiculturality and the complexities of survival tactics and strategies, or berated into another Darwinian lecture on the undead premise of the superiority of European and Euro-American thought. Dominant culture imposes its narrative of intellectual value on the dominated, but the result, as was long ago pointed out, is a double consciousness in the dominated, a cultural hybridity, a knowledge that there are at least two cultures, and more than this, two philosophies or worldviews at play, albeit one that is largely invisible to the dominant culture, which has fallen for its own mythology of superiority and universality, and therefore lacks respect and curiosity for the rest of humanity's answers to questions that are today most urgent for humanity as a whole, and not just for one ethnic group or a cluster of peoples, whether quote-unquote white or quote-unquote of color. Gatos por liebres, cats passing as hares, not quite the same meat to chew in your taco. Patriarchy passing as non-patriarchy in post-feminism, racism and Eurocentrism passing as post-identitarian ideologies and practice, the neocolonial passing as the post-colonial, the post-industrial passing as the post-maquila, post-sweatshop, post-factory, global domination passing as the post-national, gatos por liebres, cats passing as hares. Fault lines in Latino, Latinx art world discourses. Undead Darwinism and its posts create some of the fault lines that we must navigate in the US Latinx art world. There is no question that there is a difference between the early Chicana Chicano and other US Latino boomers born in the 40s and early 50s, and those born in the 60s and 70s who benefited from and who may have been raised from childhood in more decolonial ways with respect to racialization, gender, and sexuality. This is no doubt also true for mixed race and younger Euro-Americans. But women of color in the late 60s and throughout the 70s who analyzed and theorized the simultaneity of racialized, gendered, sexed, and class oppression elaborated a basic premise of the complexity and contradictions of subjectivity of the human, exacerbated by colonial and neocolonial, shifting, changing, imbricated oppressions. People of color in the Americas have analyzed, negotiated, and to the degree possible under conditions of varying degrees, opposed their physical, psychological, spiritual, and social dehumanization. Biological or cultural essentialism is not an easy pill to swallow for people who daily navigate stereotype, cultural oppression and silencing, and the fatal effects sometimes of racist and colonial Eurocentrism, although it has been imposed on the colonized and the negatively racialized, gendered, and sexed as quote-unquote truth. At a minimum, it haunts us all the way to the psychologist's couch, the bottom of the bottle, or too many joints. The capacity to perceive complexity does not belong solely to dominant cultural philosophy and its derivatives in the humanities and social sciences. In fact, it could be argued with little difficulty that where relations of intellectual, cultural, social, political, and economic power are at play, the opposite has proven true. Contrary to Eurocentric Darwinist declarations of the destruction of ancient indigenous American philosophies, the turning of perception to the non-Western that the 60s and 70s people of color intellectuals embarked upon, and which I always include, and in which I always include artists as intellectuals, and in many cases involved oral transmission in unbroken lineages. And we know now from publications and increasing public speeches that they had and have far more complex, rigorous, and ambitious ways of understanding being and natural reality. There are numerous works now published by PhDs, MDs, RNs, and other people highly accomplished by Western standards who are also initiates in the numerous culturally different traditions of the Native American and African American peoples. A Mayan elder, Don Miguel Chiquin, who traveled to speak publicly in the San Francisco Bay Area in April 2011, conveyed that the core of Mayan thought is direct and unbroken, belongs to humanity and not just to Mayans, and does not function through the logic of Western either-or dualism, but it does preserve thinking and practices that help pierce the ideological illusions we have all lived with for more than 500 years. Who authorizes our notions of being, identity, and the meaning of art and artist and its social function? Wherein lies the decolonial? What is certain is that the decolonial cannot lie in that which dehumanizes us and reproduces social inequity is a product of binary paradigms that falsely describe reality, obscuring our view of possible truth and possible integrity. Thank you. I would be very happy to take any questions or to listen to any comments that any of you have that you want to share with the group or that you want to directly address to me, please. Yes? You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you. One of the most wonderful things about many of the artists you write about, and I think about too, so Amalia Mesa Baynes is an example that comes to mind, and what her work scrambles for me when I walk into any museum and see her work is how we behave as audiences to art, and how one of the things that it triggers is that impulse to leave my own contribution to the altar form, or in Angel Suarez Rosado's work that's imbued with Espiritismo. I want, and he does invite people to perform and wear masks with him, and those happen in so-called art spaces or art spaces. And I sense, like in the presence of one of Mesa Baynes' altars in a museum, I sense that slit between who am I here? Am I the Catholic adjacent, young Mexicano who has the impulse to leave the thing, whatever I have in my pocket or cigarette or whatever, or am I art historian who knows how to behave in museums and look and not touch or alter? And so that's a comment. And then the other concept that's lying here, I think, because we've shared so many conversations with Maria Lugones too, is her concept of schizophrenia. So not Gilles and Deleuze necessarily. Maybe that's interesting too, but Lugones is schizophrenia. That's a intrinsic part of women of color experience that she talks about too. So those are comments and half a question, and I would love to know what your response is.
Yeah, no, those are both really, interesting observations, right? The kind of the blurring of that line of what it's like, to be present, in an official art space, right? Something's changing there. When we think about audience and audience interaction and how pieces are designed, right? And especially bringing the altar as a kind of installation in the museum when it really wasn't there before as a possibility for installation, brings with it those associations of, well, where does this practice of altar building come from? And scholars have done like a beautiful job of showing that, that the altar form was one of the ways in which indigenous women under colonization could continue functioning as spiritual authorities, which they were in pre-colonial Americas, and which they continued to be in some families and some communities when passing as mestizo, right? So I think that's super interesting how it opens up a different way of thinking about how do we engage an art object. I'm thinking about the way that Gloria Anzaldúa wrote, and it was probably kind of enigmatic for a lot of people unless you went and read her source. She cites one source on, I can't remember, powers of, I wish I could remember who it was, but about a scholar on African masks and how African masks are considered to be empowered objects. And so Anzaldúa in Borderlands makes a contrast between art of what she calls mere virtuosity, which is the mastery of technique, and art which is alive, right? And so she thinks about her work, alive meaning, in Anzaldúa's case, she thinks about making this object, this piece of writing that is very, very interactive. She thinks about making it through the intentionality that it is a vessel and an invitation for all kinds of energies that I think is a little bit different than an artist, and I include writers as artists, saying, I can't say what happened here. Sometimes artists will openly say, I was a kind of a medium, or the muse came, or sure, whatever you want to interpret. I think there's some of that, but there's also an opening to another way to regard. I'm thinking of how Ana Mendieta wrote about this sap, what she called a primordial sap that she felt was activated when she made her earthworks, that she thought the earth was alive and fluids and all of these things became activated through intention, and I would say probably even not intention if you're coming from a Santeria, Yoruba perspective, that things have, or an indigenous traditional view that everything is alive, right? So I don't know, I'm just chatting with you, right? And I should stop because I think that's a super interesting observation that you made. And as to Maria Lugones, because so other people can speak, I'll just say, yeah, it was like a really huge observation to think about the unequal kinds of cultural hybridity that people of color and the dominated here and elsewhere have always observed, right? But there's what Lugones, right, an Argentine queer philosopher, adds to that when she thinks about schizophrenia, is it really emphasizes the incredibly painful and disturbing and fragmenting nature of being caught between two unequal cultures. And in her case, unlike Ansaldúa, who's talking about the US-Mexico, in Lugones' case, it's like the Americas, the global South, right? We have so much more to flesh out, and I think that what we see reflected in cultural practices, including different types of art practices, also can benefit enormously from linking it specifically to psychology, right? Which is something that I do in the forthcoming book quite a lot, actually. Yes, thank you, Josh. Are there any other comments or thoughts or questions or protests? Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for that wonderful talk.
You're welcome.
One theme that I thought you wove really beautifully throughout the talk was the idea of different temporalities and alternative temporalities. You mentioned specifically the idea of chronology as not an indicator of progress and speaking against sort of Western teleologies. And certainly there's a lot of writing on indigenous and spiritual temporalities and queer time. And so I wondered if you could speak a little more explicitly to how you think alternative temporalities figure into the topic you're discussing.
Well, again, right, that's like an incredibly rich and incredibly important, there are so many ways to approach this. From a traditional Mayan perspective, and there are many, as you know, many Mayan communities, so from within the Cachiquel and the Quiche, that also represents broader Nahua peoples, right, in the Mesoamerican. I'm talking about living teachers, right, and teachers that I can cite, right, not just anthropology books. Time is one of the things that they begin talking about. They begin by talking about the creation of a Western notion, right, of the Gregorian calendar, of a Western notion of time. So the notion of time that we have is also a product. It doesn't even characterize the way that Europe itself understood time, right, before a certain time period. In a publication, Deepesh Chakrabarti, it was one of the first places I ever read. I think in the title is something like Time of the Gods, and he was writing about the impossibility to take like a Marxist perspective to thinking about labor without incorporating like spirituality and how spirituality shapes a very different existing in the present for certain indigenous laborers. And that was really, to me, really, really important, really brilliant, right? To be able to think about how the colonial and the neocolonial is really imbricated in the very terminologies that we use. And I think this is a very exciting time for really being able to examine, the genealogies, or to put it super simply, the etymologies. When you crack open something like the Oxford English Dictionary, I don't know if anybody still cracks them open, but what's cool about the Oxford, dictionary is that it has this like amazing genealogy of like how words change through different centuries to the, which just shows you the tremendous impact, right, of culture, even within one supposedly homogeneous culture. And so what do these words mean? Right? Whether it's time, whether it's art, whether it's artist, whether it's spirit, whether it's God, whether it's creator, You know, I think when people talk about the decolonial, they're talking about like a new decolonial turn. It has to do with a rethinking at the level of making meaning, at the epistemic. How do we define what gets to count as knowledge? And that begins with, what do these words mean? They're not, it's okay, we can use them, but I think we are challenged increasingly to constantly think about their historical vintage and to think about how they have under colonialism and continuing under neocolonialism been presented as like transparently universal or true, right? And so that is part of that challenge, right? So a very long response to a very, important question, how to think about alternative times and timescapes and what are the differences that they make. And I think for many quarters, people are pointing out to us that they make an enormous, amount of difference. With respect to what I've read about queer temporalities and queer futurities, I think that brings in yet another strand, which has to do with critique of the present, as a place that is not acceptable, that is not adequate, right? That in its injustice gives rise to yearning and to unhappiness and to a sense of, not belonging, but that, as people like Sarah Ahmed have written, but beginning there, instead of saying, I'm like so messed up, to really be able to take the personal and look at it in the broader social and historical context. That unhappiness can be the seed of what we should be living, what we could be living, the promise of democracies. Another time, not this one, not we don't believe it, that this is it, right? So other comments, other thoughts, thank you. I'm not sure if I've reached the end of the line.
Hi.
Hi.
Big fan of your work, by the way. Could
Thank
you
you.
provide some more context about that anecdote you referenced where a male Chicano artist called out another Chicana artist about her use of pre-Columbian variables, I believe? Could you provide more information about what that panel was? Who are the people? When was this? What was going on?
Yeah. In this essay, I twice, in this talk, I twice tell anecdotes that I choose to not name the parties involved. But what I can tell you is that I got it straight from the mouth of the dinosaur, right? I described Exhibit A, who was thrown under the bus, and she called me and was really, really obviously hurt, but also intellectually alarmed, right? Alarmed. And I think it was one of the earliest moments for me when I really began to think, because I've been a reader since I was an undergraduate of post-structuralist theory. I love it, right? I love it. And so that was very interesting to me about the contradictions and what was happening, and how people at different moments of entering the university or college, were, they kind of felt and knew that some forms of thinking constituted intellectual capital, right? And so I think that was a very interesting moment for her and for me in terms of thinking about that, how those kinds of hierarchies were beginning to be used in public, right? This was in Los Angeles. So that's as much as I'm giving. I want to say that I do tell anecdotes, not only in this chapter, but also in Chicana art and other publications, where I choose not to name, people that are involved in things that I think are really hurtful or contradictory, because I don't think it's necessary. Yeah, it runs the risk of, of people thinking I'm either making something up or exaggerating, or that it could be very useful to have more data, right? So, yeah. Yes.
Thank you so much for your talk, Laura. So I just had a question about the post the post what. And, hearing you mention De Luz, Guattari, Agamben, Rosi Braidotti came to mind, and I'm thinking of also like the post-human and how, the environment is something always, especially I feel like within Chicano Latinx narratives, it's such an important thing since we are also thinking of the ancestral sort of importance in the work. So I'm just wondering if you've thought about that, or it's just a comment, I guess, because that came to mind.
I have not read Braidotti. She's one of the countless people that are on my to-do list and that I have been told I should read, and I look forward to one day doing that. I have read. Probably related to that, and kind of more recently, I read Jane Bennett's book, which has to do with vitality, right, within nature. And I think from what I understand, there's a connection, the vital, right, the inanimate. I've also read my UC Berkeley colleagues' book, Animacies, right, and I'm drawing a blank. Mel Chen, yeah. An unforgivable blank, right? So Saved by the Bell. And so, I think that different people, and I can't talk about Braidotti because I haven't read her, but what that invites in me is thinking about how people are trying to decenter, right, humanism. And I think that's a great opportunity for coalitionary thought, right, from different locations. So to be able to reflect critically on how we are surrounded by living organisms, right? Biological tiny things include, and as well as larger creatures that are our companions, right? As Mel Chen argues, that we might have incredibly profound emotional relations to that might have been in previous moments dismissed as something crazy, right? That's my language, as something crazy, but not something that we can take seriously as to where our affect goes. All of this to me is super, super valuable. Humanism, right? When I think about humanism, I think about how the rise of Enlightenment thought and an extreme form of materialist scientificism and empiricism eventually, right, lead to, well, I think first, a kind of very honest statement. Those who haven't had certain types of spiritual experiences recognize we can't write and talk about this, to eventually this kind of thinking that these things that I cannot measure and I personally have not experienced maybe aren't real, or they're maybe not as valuable as the human. I think that's what, for many quarters, is being rethought. And I have read really cool work, of younger scholars who are developing work within Chicana studies, actually Chicana feminist studies. In the Consuelo Jimenez Underwood, you'll see there's a scholar who's been trying to work these two types of intellectual traditions and to think about how indigenous, just to say it quickly, environmentalist type of thinking. The human's not superior, everything's alive. We have to live, humans also, within an ecosystem that we affect and that affects us, right? That sort of thinking, with that decentering of a human-centric project where God is dead, but the human scientist, is not, and a certain version of the human scientist will replace that. I'm thinking about one of Derrida's last essays, which I can't remember the exact title, but it was something like On Religion, and I really was happy that I ran into it in an anthology on religion, because he said that the high priests of our day, that God was dead, but the high priests of our day now were computer people. Because most people are like, I may be smart, but I don't know how my computer works. Can you fix this? I thought that was interesting. So yes, any other thoughts, comments on Dean? How are we doing on time? Are we okay? Okay, please. Any other comments, thoughts, things to share from your own thinking or work?
Hi, I've really enjoyed listening to your talk. I'm over here. One of the things that I enjoyed so much is all the different registers that you're moving through, not just intellectually and politically, but linguistically. And it seems to me that officially we're in a very monolingual period in this country, officially. And when I listen to you and think of, all the possibilities of doing the kind of work that you do, not just bilingually, but multilingually, and all the references that you have access to, and that many other people don't. I see a kind of, a décalage. There's this kind of gap there, and I guess it's maybe a particular concern of mine related to my work. But I was just wondering how you see that, and if you see the tension, or if you have any optimistic ideas about how we can all become more bilingual and multilingual in the areas that you're working on and in other areas, and if that's important to you.
When I'm listening to you, what comes into my head is not so much literally like bilinguality. Instead, what came into my head was interdisciplinarity, And I think that like the rise of cultural studies was like one moment, but this is also true of the rise of ethnic studies as a comparative field, but also the different fields of ethnic studies, what we call that today, Native American studies, Asian diasporic, African diasporic, Latinx. I don't know if I left anything out, but anyway, I'm just thinking about like how different historical moments ask us, they invite us to move beyond, our disciplinarity. And the dangers, of course, of that are that there is a depth which comes from focusing on one particular field, like your entire career, from college through graduate school, through a doctorate, and even after, right? Dedicating like a 50-year career, maybe 60 years from the time one was an undergraduate. It produces a kind of wealth that I don't think should be like opposed to like a different kind of work. But I find it very interesting that this is the period of that the 60s, 70s eventually are going to be able to create something that we will later call comparative ethnic studies, but is all these different fields that seem to be separatist, but that if you look at them, they're very, very interdisciplinary. And especially, I would say, but not only, in terms of humanities and how they deal with, like, let's say, economics, history, like, really wanting to inform themselves of historical, cultural, political, ideological, philosophical context, right? That, to me, is actually more important. I think if we live in a place where it isn't that easy to retain mother languages or ancestral languages, and we need to really reflect on that, and I think I would love to see that change. I mean, I have numerous friends that aren't, Latino, who deeply reflect that their grandparents stopped speaking Polish, French, Italian, et cetera, because of the melting pot ideology that after indigenous people and African people, right, got to work on them. And so I think that, I don't know, people's lives and circumstances lead them to wanting to know more languages if they have that opportunity. But it isn't just the linguistic, because it isn't just the linguistic that defines whether we're, let's say, for example, what we're talking about at this conference, Latinx. To be Latinx is also to not speak Spanish. It's also to speak broken Spanish. It's to have to learn, Shirley Moraga, right, a very well-known writer. Shirley had to teach herself Spanish again, I'd say again, had to learn Spanish, So and I did too, not as much as Shirley, but I did too, So what is it? Walter Mignolo, I'll leave it at this. Walter Mignolo has written about disciplinarity, right? And he's written about the importance of moving beyond universality to what he calls pluriversality. And that's a concept I like a lot. It's kindred to what many people say with other terminology, kindred to what I think, as well. And that is, can we have many worlds, whether we speak one language or 3 or 5? But the challenge is, how do we coexist for real democratic ways, for real respectful ways? Respect doesn't mean we have to like it, but that we recognize that our view is only one, it's parochial. We're all parochial, right? And we have so much to learn from each other. And at this historical moment, I have a 22-year-old, and I made something about how I said something about how it would be so awesome for me. I did say for me if she had a ton of kids. And she looked at me, you know, and I rarely let myself say anything like that. But on this occasion, I don't know, I was watching something corny on TV, and I said, I better like fish and see what happens. And I actually got teary-eyed, and I feel even emotional thinking about it right now. She said, what makes you think that I would want to have children? And I said, well, no, I mean, if you want, that would be like awesome for me. She goes, no, but with the world the way it is right now, they had just recently said that we have like 12 years, right? Something came out in the news to deeply, deeply turn around the environmental crises. So right now is an amazing moment for us to take each other seriously and to learn everything we can from each other. Yeah. We're increasingly a multicultural world, not just a multicultural US. So thank you for that question.